I threw an entire bottle of 1947 Chateau d'Yquem, worth more than my yearly salary, more than 6 months of rent in my shoebox apartment, more than everything I owned combined, directly onto Dante Salvatore's pristine white shirt. And the moment that golden liquid made contact with Italian silk, his steel-gray eyes snapped to mine with the force of a lightning strike. And every single man in the restaurant, all 15 of them, with their shoulder holsters and dead stares, reached for their guns in a synchronized movement that would have been beautiful if it wasn't absolutely terrifying. But I didn't flinch, didn't gasp, didn't even blink. Because in exactly 3 seconds, maybe less, the bullet that had been meant for his skull, the one being lined up by the sniper positioned across the street in the abandoned office building, the one whose laser sight I'd caught reflecting off the crystal water glasses on table 7, would shatter the chandelier behind him instead of painting the white tablecloth with his brains. The sound of breaking crystal was almost delicate, a musical tinkling that seemed completely at odds with the chaos erupting around me as Dante's body moved on pure instinct, rising from his chair with the fluid grace of a predator, his hand already reaching inside his jacket, while his men formed a protective barrier around him. And I felt hands grab me from behind, rough and unforgiving, slamming me face first onto the nearest table hard enough that the silverware jumped and clattered to the floor. The entire restaurant, luminoso with its velvet curtains and its candlelight and its carefully cultivated atmosphere of dangerous elegance, had transformed into a war zone in the space of a heartbeat. And I was at the center of it, pressed down so hard against the white linen that I could barely breathe, could barely think, could only feel the cold press of a gun barrel against the base of my skull, and hear the rapid-fire Italian being shouted over my head. "Don't shoot her." Dante's voice cut through the chaos like a blade, smooth and cold and utterly commanding, the kind of voice that made grown men fall silent and obey without question. And the pressure on my head eased just slightly, just enough that I could turn my face to the side and gasp in a desperate breath. Bring her to me instead, because I want to understand exactly what just happened here, and I want to hear it from her own lips, before I decide whether she lives or dies. They hauled me up roughly, their fingers digging into my arms hard enough to bruise, hard enough that I knew I'd have purple finger marks blooming across my pale skin by morning if I even lived to see morning, and they dragged me toward him while my feet scrambled to find purchase on the polished floor. Dante stood there in his wine-soaked shirt. The fabric clinging to what I could now see was a body built for violence, despite the expensive tailoring that usually concealed it. And his eyes, those impossible gray eyes that looked like storm clouds over a dark sea, were fixed on me with an intensity that made my stomach clench and my breath catch in my throat for reasons that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with something far more dangerous. "The chandelier!" I managed to gasp out, my voice rough and shaking despite my best efforts to sound calm, to sound collected, to sound like a woman who hadn't just thrown her entire life away on a split-second decision. "Look at the chandelier. Look at the angle of the damage. Look at where the bullet hit. And you'll understand that 3 seconds ago, you were a dead man. And the only reason you're still breathing is because I knocked you out of the kill zone." His eyes flickered upward, just for a moment. Just long enough to take in the shattered crystal and the fresh bullet hole in the ornate plasterwork. And I watched something shift in his expression, something calculating and sharp sliding behind those storm cloud eyes as he processed what I was telling him, as he reconstructed the last 30 seconds, and understood with the quick intelligence of a man who hadn't survived this long in his world by being slow or stupid. He raised one hand, a simple gesture, elegant and economical, and immediately the hands holding me released their grip, though I could feel the presence of his men still surrounding me, still ready to put me down at the slightest indication from their boss. "Everyone out," Dante said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying to every corner of the now silent restaurant. And I watched as the other diners, the men in their expensive suits, and the women in their glittering jewelry, who had thrown themselves under tables at the first sign of trouble, began to file out quickly and quietly, knowing better than to argue or ask questions or do anything other than exactly what Dante Salvatore told them to do. "Marco, I want that building across the street cleared and searched within the next 5 minutes, and I want whoever was stupid enough to take a shot at me brought to me alive if possible, dead if necessary. But either way, I want answers, and I want them tonight." The restaurant emptied like water down a drain, silent and swift, until it was just me and Dante and 3 of his men, the ones who clearly never left his side, the ones whose eyes were flat and dead and utterly loyal. I stood there dripping wine onto the expensive carpet. My white shirt, the uniform shirt that I'd pressed so carefully this morning in my tiny apartment, now stained an ugly yellow-brown, and I tried to control the trembling that had started in my hands and was threatening to spread through my entire body as the adrenaline began to fade and the reality of what I'd just done began to sink in like ice water in my veins. "What's your name?" Dante asked, and his voice was different now, quieter, more thoughtful, as he pulled out his chair and sat back down as though assassination attempts were just another Tuesday evening inconvenience, as though he hadn't just come within inches of death, as though the wine soaking through his shirt and the shattered crystal littering the floor were nothing more than minor annoyances. "Sarah," I whispered, then cleared my throat and tried again with more strength, more conviction, even though my voice still shook at the edges. "Sarah Volkov, I'm a waitress here. I've been working at Luminosa for 8 months, and I swear I had nothing to do with whoever took that shot at you. I just saw the laser sight and reacted, and I know that probably sounds insane, but I'm telling you the truth." "Volkov," he repeated, and the way he said it made my blood run cold, made my heart stutter in my chest, because he said it like he was tasting the syllables, testing them, like he recognized something in that name even though I'd been so careful, so impossibly careful to stay invisible and unremarkable and beneath notice. "That's Russian, isn't it?" Which is interesting because we don't get many Russian waitresses in this particular establishment, not when everyone knows that Luminosa caters specifically to a certain type of clientele, the kind who would normally make someone with Russian blood extremely nervous about showing their face. I wanted to lie, wanted to spin some story about my grandmother and immigration and a family history that had nothing to do with the world he inhabited, but something in his eyes told me that he would know, that he would see through any deception I tried to construct. And besides, I was suddenly so tired of lying, so exhausted from years of pretending to be someone smaller and weaker and less significant than I really was. "My father was Russian," I admitted, keeping my voice steady, even though my heart was hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. "But he's been dead for 5 years, and I've been on my own ever since, working whatever jobs I could find and trying very hard to stay out of everyone's way, including yours. And yet here you are, very much in my way, having just saved my life with reflexes that no ordinary waitress should possess," Dante observed, leaning back in his chair and studying me with those penetrating gray eyes that seemed to see straight through skin and bone to whatever truths I was trying to hide. "Which makes me wonder what else you're not telling me, Sarah Volkov, and what other secrets you might be keeping behind those pretty green eyes." The way he said pretty made something hot and dangerous coil low in my stomach, made my breath catch and my skin flush, despite the absolute insanity of being attracted to a man who could have me killed with a single word, a man who represented everything I'd been running from for the last 5 years, a man whose world I'd sworn I would never let pull me back under. "I kept you alive," I said instead, forcing steel into my voice, forcing myself to meet his gaze without flinching even, though everything in me wanted to look away, wanted to run, wanted to disappear before he could dig any deeper into who I really was. "Doesn't that buy me anything? Can't I just walk away and pretend this never happened?" "Walk away," Dante repeated, and there was something almost amused in his tone now, something that suggested he found my naivety charming in a darkly entertaining way. "My dear Sarah, you just threw a $10,000 bottle of wine on me in a room full of witnesses. You disrupted an assassination attempt, which means someone now knows their plan failed and will be scrambling to understand how. And most importantly, you've made yourself interesting to me, which is perhaps the most dangerous thing you could have possibly done." He stood then, moving with that same predatory grace, and crossed the space between us in 3 long strides that ate up the distance, and left him standing close enough that I could smell his cologne, something dark and expensive with notes of cedar and smoke, close enough that I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact, because he was tall, so much taller than I'd realized when he was sitting down. "You're going to come to my office tomorrow at noon," he said, and it wasn't a request, wasn't even really a command, but something more fundamental than that, something that assumed my compliance as an inevitable fact of nature. "We're going to have a much longer conversation about who you really are, why you move like someone with combat training, and how exactly you spotted a sniper sight that none of my very well-paid security team managed to notice." "And if I don't come?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer, even though the question was pointless because we both understood the reality of the situation, the power dynamic that had been established the moment I'd stepped into his world, however accidentally. Dante smiled then, and it was a beautiful smile, the kind that probably made women weak in the knees and men afraid for their lives, the kind that held promises of pleasure and pain in equal measure. "Then I'll come find you, Sarah Volkoff, and trust me when I say that you would much prefer to meet me in my office rather than wherever I might track you down, because I'm significantly more civilized when I'm on my own territory." He reached into his jacket, the same motion that had started earlier but never finished because of my intervention, and pulled out a business card, crisp and cream-colored with embossed lettering that probably cost more than my weekly paycheck, and pressed it into my hand with fingers that were warm and strong and sent electricity shooting up my arm at the brief contact. "Tomorrow at noon, don't be late, and Sarah, wear something that won't show wine stains, because I have a feeling our meetings are going to be consistently eventful." Then he was walking away, his men falling into formation around him like a well-trained pack, and I was left standing there in the empty restaurant with a business card in my hand and the terrible, sinking certainty that my carefully constructed life of invisibility had just shattered as completely and irreversibly as the crystal chandelier, and that whatever happened next, whatever Dante Salvatore discovered about who I really was and what I'd been hiding from, would change everything in ways I couldn't even begin to imagine, in ways that terrified me almost as much as the heat that had pooled in my stomach when he'd stood close enough for me to feel his breath on my face and called me interesting, as though being interesting to a man like him wasn't the most dangerous thing in the world. His penthouse smelled like expensive cigars and danger, like leather and aged whiskey and something darker underneath that I couldn't quite name, but recognized on an instinctive level as the scent of power and violence carefully contained beneath a veneer of civilization. And I stood in the center of his marble foyer, thinking that I shouldn't have come, that I should have run the moment I left Luminosa last night, should have grabbed Nadia and disappeared into the network of safe houses and false identities that I'd spent 5 years building for exactly this kind of emergency. But when a man like Dante Salvatore extends an invitation, when he looks at you with those storm cloud eyes and says, "Tomorrow at noon," in a voice that brooks no argument, you either show up or you disappear permanently. And disappearing would mean leaving my sister behind, would mean abandoning the only family I had left in this world. And that was something I simply couldn't do no matter how much danger I'd just walked myself into. The elevator had been made of glass and chrome and had risen so smoothly through the building that I'd barely felt the movement, just watched the city spread out beneath me like a glittering map of territories and power plays. And now I was here in his private domain, waiting while his assistant, a severe woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and sharper cheekbones, had disappeared to announce my arrival. The art on the walls was original, I could tell that much. Pieces that probably cost more than most people made in a lifetime. Abstract paintings in violent reds and deep blacks that seemed to pulse with barely contained chaos. And I wondered if they'd been chosen deliberately, if they were meant to reflect something about the man who lived here, or if they were simply investments. Pretty things to own, because ownership itself was a form of power. "Miss Volkoff," a voice said from behind me, and I turned to find not Dante, but a man I recognized from last night, one of the three who had stayed behind. Tall and broad, with the kind of face that had seen too much violence to ever look truly peaceful. "He's ready for you now, and I should probably warn you that he's been awake all night running down leads on the shooter, which means his temper is even shorter than usual, so I'd recommend being as honest as possible with whatever he asks you, because he has very little patience for games when he's tired." I followed him through a hallway, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city, through a set of double doors that opened into an office that was somehow both elegant and intimidating. All dark wood and leather furniture arranged around a massive desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of black walnut. Dante sat behind that desk, still wearing white but a fresh shirt this time, crisp and perfect, and somehow making his eyes look even more intense in the morning light that streamed through the windows. And he looked up as I entered with an expression that was impossible to read, something between curiosity and calculation, and something else that made my pulse quicken, despite my best efforts to remain calm and collected. "Serafina Volkoff," he said, and the use of my full name, the name I hadn't used in 5 years, the name I'd buried along with my father and my old life, sent ice water through my veins and made my hands clench into fists at my sides. "Daughter of Alexei Volkov, who was one of the most successful arms dealers in the Russian underground until someone put 3 bullets in his head during a meeting in Prague, and sister to Nadia Volkov, who is currently a freshman at City College studying art history, living in a dorm room on the east side of campus, and who has absolutely no idea that her older sister has been working minimum wage jobs for the last 5 years while living under a false identity." The room tilted slightly. Or maybe that was just my sense of balance deserting me as I realized exactly how thoroughly he'd had me investigated, how completely he'd unraveled the life I'd so carefully constructed. And I had to lock my knees to keep from swaying, because showing weakness now would be fatal in ways that had nothing to do with physical death, and everything to do with losing whatever small amount of leverage I might still possess. "You've been busy," I managed to say, keeping my voice level even though my heart was trying to hammer its way out of my chest, even though every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to run, to fight, to do something other than stand here and let him dissect my life like a specimen under glass. "I'm always busy. But when someone saves my life and then turns out to be hiding a very interesting past, I make time to dig deeper. Because in my experience, people don't just stumble into situations like last night by accident," Dante replied, standing and moving around the desk with that same predatory grace that seemed to be as natural to him as breathing. "You grew up in your father's world, which means you know exactly what kind of man I am and what kind of business I run, and yet you still chose to work at a restaurant that caters specifically to people like me, which suggests either incredibly poor judgment or a very specific reason for wanting to be close to this particular world while pretending you want nothing to do with it." He was right, of course, which was the most infuriating part of this entire conversation, because I had chosen Luminosa deliberately, had chosen a place where I could keep my finger on the pulse of the underground while maintaining enough distance to stay safe, where I could hear the whispers and rumors and know when danger was moving in my direction. "I needed the money, and they pay well," I said, which was true even if it wasn't the whole truth, even if it didn't explain why I'd chosen this restaurant specifically out of all the places I could have worked. "They pay well because they cater to dangerous men who tip in $100 bills and expect absolute discretion, which you've been providing for 8 months, while apparently developing the skills necessary to spot assassination attempts before they happen," Dante continued. And he was close now, close enough that I could see the fine lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than his reputation would indicate, close enough that I could see the shadow of exhaustion on his face that told me his assistant had been telling the truth about him being awake all night. "So here's what's going to happen, Sarah. Because I don't believe in coincidences, and I don't believe that you just happened to be serving my table last night, and I definitely don't believe that someone with your background and your reflexes is just an innocent waitress trying to make ends meet. I wanted to interrupt, wanted to protest, wanted to tell him he was wrong about everything. But the look in his eyes stopped me cold because it was the look of a man who held all the cards and knew it, who had already made his decision and was simply explaining the terms rather than negotiating them. "You're going to work for me," he said, and the words landed like a physical blow, like a door slamming shut on the last 5 years of my carefully maintained freedom. "You're going to stay close to me, closer than my own shadow, and you're going to use those instincts that saved my life last night to keep me alive, because clearly, I need someone watching my back who sees threats that my expensive security team somehow manages to miss." "And if I refuse?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer, even though the question was as pointless now as it had been last night, because men like Dante Salvatore didn't make offers that could be refused. They made declarations that looked like choices, but were really inevitabilities dressed up in polite words. "Then I'll make a few phone calls, let it slip in certain circles that Alexei Volkov's daughter is alive and well and living in my city, and we both know exactly what would happen after that, don't we?" Dante said quietly, and there was no cruelty in his voice, no gloating or satisfaction, just a simple statement of fact that was somehow more terrifying than any threat could have been. "Your father made a lot of enemies in his life, Sarah, and those enemies have long memories and even longer reach. And the only reason you and your sister have survived this long is because everyone assumed you died with him or disappeared into Russia where you'd be impossible to find." My throat had gone dry, completely dry, like I'd swallowed sand instead of air, and I had to force the next words out through what felt like a rapidly closing windpipe. "You would do that? You would put a target on my back just to force my compliance?" "I would do whatever is necessary to keep myself alive and my business running, because I have responsibilities that extend far beyond just my own survival. And right now, you represent both a potential asset and a potential liability, and I always prefer to convert liabilities into assets whenever possible," Dante replied. And then he did something that surprised me, something that shifted the entire tenor of the conversation in a way I hadn't expected. He pulled out his phone, swiped through a few screens, and then turned it to face me, showing me a photograph that made my blood run cold and my vision narrow to a single point of absolute terror. It was Nadia, my baby sister, leaving her dorm building with her backpack slung over one shoulder and her headphones in, completely oblivious to the camera that had captured her or the man following 3 steps behind her. A man whose face I didn't recognize but whose purpose I understood with perfect, horrible clarity. "She's already been found," I whispered, and my voice sounded distant and strange even to my own ears, like it was coming from somewhere outside my body. "Someone already knows where she is, which means refusing you wouldn't save her anyway. It would just mean she dies alone while I'm on the run. I took that photograph this morning, right before I had my men pick up the person who'd been following her and bring him to one of my warehouses for questioning," Dante said. And there was something in his voice now that might have been sympathy, might have been understanding, but was probably just calculation disguised as compassion. "He works for the Kozlov family, which I'm sure is a name you recognize, and he'd been tracking her for 3 days before my people spotted him and realized he was interested in someone who shouldn't have been on anyone's radar unless they knew exactly who to look for. The Kozlov family, who had lost $2 million worth of weapons when my father's last deal went catastrophically wrong, who had blamed him for the loss even though it had been their own security that failed, who had sworn vengeance on everyone connected to Alexei Volkov and had spent the last 5 years hunting down anyone who might have information about where their money had gone. "What do you want from me?" I asked. And I hated how defeated I sounded, hated how completely he'd backed me into a corner where I had no choices left, no options except the ones he was offering. "I want you to do what you did last night, to watch for threats and eliminate them before they become problems, to stand at my side and keep us both alive while I finish the work I've started in this city," Dante said, and he reached out then, his fingers tilting my chin up so that I had to meet his eyes, had to see the intensity burning there like a banked fire waiting to ignite. "And in return, I'll keep your sister safe. I'll give her protection that she doesn't even know she needs," and I'll make sure that the Kozlovs and every other family that might want to finish what they started with your father understand that touching her would mean going to war with me, which is something very few people are stupid enough to attempt. His touch was warm, warmer than it should have been, and I could feel the calluses on his fingers that spoke of a man who didn't just give orders, but carried them out himself when necessary. And something in me responded to that touch in a way that terrified me almost as much as the situation I'd found myself trapped in. You're asking me to become exactly what I've been running from for 5 years, to step back into a world that destroyed my father and nearly destroyed me. And you're asking me to do it while staying close to you. Close to someone who represents everything dangerous and deadly about the life I swore I'd never return to, I said. And my voice was shaking now. Shaking with anger and fear and something else that I refused to name, refused to acknowledge even as it coiled hot and insistent in my stomach. I'm not asking, Sarah. I'm telling you what's going to happen, but I'm also promising you something that no one else in this city can promise, which is that your sister will live to graduate college and have a normal life. The kind of life you've been trying so desperately to give her, Dante said, and his thumb brushed across my jaw in a gesture that was almost tender, almost gentle, before he released me and stepped back. You have one condition you can make, one rule you can set before we begin this arrangement. So tell me what it is, and I'll decide whether I can live with it. I knew what I should ask for, knew I should demand money or protection or some guarantee of my own safety. But what came out of my mouth was something entirely different, something that revealed more about my own fears than I wanted to admit. You never touch me without my permission, I said, my voice stronger now, more certain, even as my skin still tingled where his fingers had been. Whatever this arrangement is, however close I have to stay to you, my body belongs to me, and only me, and you don't get to take that away just because you're holding my sister's life over my head. Dante smiled then, and it was a different smile than the one from last night, something darker and more knowing, something that suggested he'd seen right through my words to the fear underneath, the fear that had nothing to do with violence, and everything to do with the way my body had responded to his proximity, to his touch, to the dangerous magnetism that surrounded him like an aura. I don't take what isn't freely given, Malishka, he said, and the Russian endearment rolled off his tongue like honey and smoke, like a promise and a threat combined into a single word. But I think we both know that eventually you're going to beg me to break that rule, because whatever this is between us, whatever sparked to life the moment you threw wine on me and looked at me like you weren't afraid to die, it's not going away just because you want it to, and fighting it is only going to make it burn hotter when you finally give in. The presumption in his words should have made me angry, should have made me want to prove him wrong, but instead it sent heat flooding through my body and made my breath catch in my throat. Because somewhere deep down, in a place I didn't want to examine too closely, I knew he was right. Knew that the attraction I'd felt last night hadn't been a momentary aberration, but something real and dangerous and completely inevitable. I should hate you for this, I said. And I meant it. Meant every word, even as I accepted the phone he was holding out to me now, even as I understood that I was agreeing to his terms, stepping into the cage he'd built, and letting the door swing shut behind me. You probably should, Dante agreed, and there was something almost like regret in his voice, almost like he wished things could be different even as he orchestrated this trap. But hate is just another kind of passion, Sarah. And I've learned over the years that passion in any form can be useful if you know how to channel it properly. So hate me if you need to. But do it while keeping me alive. And maybe someday you'll understand that I'm not the monster you think I am. That everything I do, every move I make, serves a purpose that's bigger than just my own survival or my own power. I wanted to ask what he meant. Wanted to understand what could possibly justify the life he led and the things he'd undoubtedly done to rise to the position he now held. But before I could form the question, his phone rang, the sound sharp and urgent in the quiet office, and he answered it with a curt, "What?" that made me understand exactly why his assistant had warned me about his temper. I watched his expression shift as he listened to whoever was on the other end. Watched it go from irritation to something harder and colder, and infinitely more dangerous. And when he hung up and turned back to me, there was something in his eyes that made my stomach drop, and my hands go numb. "The man who was following your sister?" Dante said, his voice perfectly calm, in a way that somehow made his words more terrifying. He just stopped breathing during questioning, right before he could tell us who hired him and what they know about you, which means someone wanted him silenced badly enough to dose him with a slow-acting poison that wouldn't take effect until several hours after his capture. And that level of precaution suggests we have a much bigger problem than just the Kozlovs looking for revenge. 3 weeks in Dante's world, and I'd already killed twice, both times with my hands still steady and my conscience surprisingly quiet. Both times to save his life when threats materialized from shadows and corners that his expensive security team somehow failed to adequately monitor. And each time I pulled a trigger or slid a blade between ribs, he watched me with those storm cloud eyes like he was trying to solve a puzzle written in my scars. Like he was piecing together the mystery of who I really was beneath the carefully constructed facade of the frightened runaway that I'd been pretending to be for so long. I was starting to think that the most dangerous thing in his empire wasn't his enemies or their increasingly desperate attempts to eliminate him, wasn't the complex web of alliances and betrayals that governed the underground world he commanded with such absolute authority, but rather it was him. It was Dante himself, with his penetrating gaze and his unexpected moments of tenderness, and his ability to make me feel simultaneously more alive and more terrified than I'd felt in the 5 years since I'd watched my father's blood pool on concrete and sworn I'd never return to this life. The first kill had happened during a meeting at one of his warehouses, a cavernous space filled with shipping containers and the smell of salt water and diesel fuel, where Dante had been negotiating with a supplier who'd been skimming profits for months and thought he could talk his way out of consequences. I'd been standing against the wall, trying to look inconspicuous despite the fact that everyone in the room kept glancing at me with expressions that ranged from curiosity to outright hostility when I'd noticed the way one of the supplier's bodyguards kept shifting his weight, kept moving his hand incrementally closer to the gun, holstered at his hip, kept watching Dante with the kind of focused intensity that spoke of intention rather than mere vigilance. The moment his fingers closed around the grip of his weapon, the moment I saw his shoulder tense in preparation for the draw, I'd moved without thinking, without planning, my own gun clearing its holster and firing in one fluid motion that my father had drilled into me over and over until it became muscle memory more reliable than conscious thought. And the bodyguard had dropped with a neat hole in his forehead before he'd managed to aim his weapon anywhere near Dante's direction. The silence that had followed had been absolute and suffocating, broken only by the metallic clatter of the dead man's gun hitting the concrete floor. And I'd stood there with my weapon still raised and my heart hammering and waited for Dante's reaction. Waited to see if I'd just made a catastrophic mistake by revealing exactly how well-trained and how dangerous I actually was. But instead of anger or suspicion or fear, I'd seen something else flicker across his face, something that looked almost like satisfaction, like I'd just confirmed something he'd already suspected. And when he'd spoken, his voice had been calm and steady and directed at the now terrified supplier, rather than at me. "I think we're done here, and you can consider your debt paid with your man's life. But if I ever discover you're stealing from me again, it won't be your employee who pays the price," he'd said. And then he'd walked out of that warehouse like men didn't die in front of him on a regular basis, like the violence was just another Tuesday afternoon transaction. And I'd followed because that was my job now, to follow and protect, and pretend that killing for him was somehow different from the killing I'd grown up watching my father orchestrate. The second kill had been messier, more personal, happening just 4 days ago at one of his nightclubs, where the music was so loud it made my bones vibrate, and the press of bodies on the dance floor created a kind of living maze that was impossible to monitor effectively. Dante had been meeting with someone in the VIP section, someone whose face I hadn't recognized, but whose posture had screamed law enforcement, or perhaps federal agent, And I'd been scanning the crowd with the kind of paranoid attention to detail that came from growing up knowing that death could arrive from any direction at any moment. The woman had been good, I had to give her that. Dressed like every other club patron in a tight dress and heels that should have made movement difficult, but somehow didn't. Blending into the crowd so perfectly that I'd almost missed her entirely. Almost failed to notice the way she was moving with purpose rather than aimlessly. Almost didn't catch the glint of light off the blade she'd palmed as she approached the velvet rope that separated the VIP section from the general population. I'd intercepted her before she'd gotten within 10 feet of Dante, my hand closing around her wrist with enough force to make her gasp and drop the knife. And then we'd been fighting in earnest. A brutal close-quarters struggle that sent us crashing through dancers who scattered with shrieks of alarm while security tried to push through the crowd to reach us. She'd been trained, well-trained, her strikes precise and economical, and aimed at nerve clusters and pressure points that would have incapacitated me if they'd landed. But I'd been trained by someone better. Trained by my father, who'd believed that his daughter needed to be able to defend herself in a world where women were often targets, and rarely taken seriously as threats. The fight had ended when I'd gotten behind her and applied pressure to her carotid artery, cutting off blood flow to her brain until she'd gone limp in my arms, and I'd dragged her unconscious body into a back hallway where Dante's men had been waiting to take her, somewhere for questioning that I knew would be thorough and probably fatal regardless of what information she provided. Dante had found me in that hallway afterward, still breathing hard and nursing bruised knuckles and a split lip, where she'd managed to land one solid hit. And instead of thanking me or asking if I was all right, he'd simply looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher and said, "You move like a ghost. Like violence is a language you speak fluently. And I'm starting to understand that your father didn't just raise you in his world. He raised you to be a weapon in it." I hadn't known how to respond to that. Hadn't known whether it was an accusation or an observation, or perhaps even a compliment in his twisted worldview. So I'd just stared back at him, with blood from my split lip sliding down my chin, and waited for whatever would come next. For whatever judgment or reward or punishment he'd decided I'd earned. What had come next was this moment. 3 days after that nightclub fight. Standing in his private quarters in the penthouse while he personally cleaned and stitched the knife wound in my side that I'd acquired 2 hours earlier when yet another assassin had gotten too close, and I'd taken a blade meant for Dante's ribs. The wound wasn't deep, more of a slice than a stab, but it was long, and it was bleeding steadily, and it hurt in the way that all wounds hurt when the adrenaline finally wore off and left you with nothing but the damage and the realization of how close you'd come to something much worse. His hands were surprisingly gentle as they worked, cleaning the wound with antiseptic that burned like liquid fire, and then pulling the edges together with neat, practiced stitches that told me this wasn't the first time he'd done emergency medical work. And we were close, so close that I could count his eyelashes and see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, and feel the heat of his breath on my bare skin, where he'd cut away my shirt to access the wound. "You should have let him stab me instead," Dante murmured as he tied off another stitch, his fingers steady and sure despite the intimacy of the moment, despite the fact that I was sitting on his bathroom counter, in nothing but my bra and pants, while he touched me with a clinical precision that somehow felt more personal than any caress. "This is the 3rd time in as many weeks that you've put yourself between me and harm, and I'm starting to worry that you've developed some kind of martyr complex. Some need to prove your worth through self-sacrifice that's going to get you killed long before anyone manages to get to me." "That's my job, isn't it?" I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, even though the combination of pain and proximity was making my thoughts fuzzy and indistinct, making it hard to remember why I was supposed to be maintaining distance from this man who held my sister's life in his hands, and seemed to be working his way into my thoughts with the same inexorable determination he applied to everything else. "You're paying me to keep you alive, to be your guardian angel or whatever poetic bullshit term you want to use, which means taking hits that are aimed at you and making sure that whoever wants you dead has to go through me first." "I'm not paying you, Sarah. I'm blackmailing you. And there's a difference between doing a job and actively courting death on someone else's behalf, Dante said. And there was something in his voice now that I'd never heard before. Something that might have been concern, or possibly even fear. Though the idea of Dante Salvatore being afraid of anything seemed almost laughable. The deal was that you'd watch my back and use your instincts to spot threats. Not that you'd throw yourself on every blade and bullet aimed in my general direction. And if you die protecting me, then your sister loses her protection, and I lose the only person who's managed to save my life multiple times in the space of a month, which makes your death inconvenient for everyone involved. He finished the last stitch and reached for a bandage, his fingers brushing against my skin in a way that sent electricity racing up my spine and made my breath catch in a manner that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with the dangerous attraction that had been building between us since the moment I'd thrown wine on his shirt and looked into his eyes without flinching. "Maybe I'm not trying to die for you," I said quietly, my voice dropping to almost a whisper in the silence of his bathroom, where the only sounds were our breathing and the distant hum of the city beyond the windows. "Maybe I'm just trying to prove to myself that I can be the person my father raised me to be, that I can step back into this world and be good at it, be useful in it, without losing myself completely the way he did." Dante's hands stilled on the bandage he was applying, and when he looked up at me, our faces were inches apart, close enough that I could see the exhaustion etched into the fine lines around his eyes, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of his cologne mixing with the antiseptic and the copper tang of blood. "Your father lost himself because he forgot that there was anything worth preserving beneath the violence and the power plays," he said. And his voice had gone soft, almost intimate, in a way that made my heart rate accelerate and my skin flush with heat that had nothing to do with the wound in my side. "But you haven't forgotten, Sarah. You still have your sister to protect, and a life you're trying to build, and a conscience that clearly bothers you even if you pretend it doesn't, which means you're not lost yet, not even close. And I'll be damned if I'm going to be the reason you cross that final line." "You say that like you care whether I keep my soul intact," I challenged, and I don't know what made me brave enough or stupid enough to say it, to call out the thing that had been humming between us for weeks now, the connection that went beyond employer and employee, beyond blackmailer and victim, into territory that was far more dangerous than any assassin's bullet. "You say that like I'm more to you than just a useful tool, more than just the weapon you forced into your service. But we both know that's not true, that I'm just another asset in your empire, valuable only as long as I'm keeping you alive and expendable the moment I fail." "You think you're just a tool to me?" Dante asked, and there was something almost like hurt in his voice now, something vulnerable that I'd never expected to hear from a man with his reputation and his power. "You think I personally stitch up all my employees when they get injured in my service, that I lose sleep worrying about whether they're going to do something reckless and get themselves killed, that I watch them move through my world with a combination of admiration and terror because they're simultaneously the most dangerous and most captivating person I've ever met?" His words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication and meaning that I wasn't sure I was ready to process, wasn't sure I could afford to acknowledge given the precarious nature of our arrangement, and the fact that any emotional entanglement would just give him more power over me than he already possessed. "Don't," I whispered, and I meant for it to sound like a warning, like a command, but it came out more like a plea, more like I was begging him not to make this harder than it already was, not to take this thing between us and make it real instead of letting it remain safely abstract and deniable. "Don't what?" he asked, and his hand came up to cut my face, his thumb brushing across my cheekbone in a gesture that was tender and possessive in equal measure, and I knew I should pull away, should remind him of the rule I'd set, the boundary that was supposed to keep us both safe from the inevitable complications that would arise if we let this attraction become something more. "Don't touch you without permission? Don't tell you the truth about what you've become to me in the space of 3 weeks? Don't admit that you're not my employee anymore, Sarah. You're my addiction, And every time you risk your life for mine, every time you move through violence like it's a dance you were born to perform, I become more convinced that you were made for this world, made for me, in ways that terrify me almost as much as they compel me. I should have pushed him away, should have climbed down from the counter and reminded him that this couldn't happen, that I couldn't let myself feel anything for the man who was blackmailing me into service, who held my sister's safety over my head like a sword that could drop at any moment. But instead I found myself leaning into his touch, found myself letting my eyes drift closed as his thumb traced patterns on my skin, found myself wanting with an intensity that shocked me, wanting to close the distance between us and taste his mouth and forget for just a moment that this was all built on coercion and necessity rather than choice. Dante, I breathed, and his name on my lips felt like surrender, felt like I was giving him something I could never take back. And maybe I was. Maybe that's exactly what this moment represented. I know, he said quietly, and his forehead came to rest against mine, and we stayed like that for a long moment, breathing the same air, existing in the same space, teetering on the edge of something that would change everything if we let it. I know this is complicated and wrong and probably the worst idea either of us has ever had, but I also know that I've never met anyone like you, anyone who looks at me and sees both the monster and the man, and doesn't flinch from either one. And that kind of acceptance is rare enough that I'm not willing to let it go without at least acknowledging what it is. The moment stretched between us, taut and trembling with possibility, and I could feel my resolve cracking, could feel the walls I'd built around my heart starting to crumble under the weight of his words and his touch and the undeniable chemistry that had been building since the night I'd saved his life. But before I could make the mistake of closing the distance between us, before I could let myself fall into something that would complicate everything and give him even more power over me, his phone rang with the sharp, insistent tone that I'd learned meant emergency, meant something had gone wrong somewhere in his empire that required his immediate attention. He pulled back with a curse, his hand dropping from my face as he reached for the phone, and I watched the tender, vulnerable man disappear behind the cold, calculating boss as he answered with a curt, "Report." I listened as his expression shifted from irritation to concern to something darker and more dangerous, watched as his free hand clenched into a fist and his jaw tightened with barely contained rage, and when he hung up and turned back to me, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever had just been reported was going to change everything, was going to shatter whatever fragile peace we'd found in the last 3 weeks. "The woman from the nightclub? The one you stopped from killing me?" Dante said, and his voice was perfectly controlled in that way that meant he was absolutely furious beneath the calm exterior. "She just died in custody before we could extract any useful information from her, poisoned the same way as the man who was following your sister, which confirms what I'd started to suspect, which is that someone with significant resources and reach is orchestrating these attacks, someone who's willing to sacrifice their own people to keep their identity hidden. And that level of paranoia and precaution suggests we're not dealing with the Kozlovs or any of my usual enemies, but rather someone entirely new, someone who's been planning this for long, enough to have contingencies and fail-safes built into every layer of their operation. I found Nadia's necklace on my bed, the delicate silver chain with the tiny compass pendant that our mother had given her before she died, the one piece of jewelry my sister never took off, because she said it reminded her that she could always find her way home, and seeing it lying there against the dark silk of Dante's guest room sheets made my blood run cold and my vision narrow to a single point of absolute terror, because Nadia would never have taken it off willingly, would never have let it leave her possession unless someone had ripped it from her throat, or worse. The note tucked beneath the chain was simple, typed rather than handwritten to avoid any possibility of identification, and the words seemed to burn themselves into my brain as I read them over and over, trying to make them mean something different than what they so clearly stated. "Come alone to the address below at midnight, or she dies screaming. And don't bother trying to trace this message because by the time you're reading it, the person who delivered it will already be dead from the same poison that's kept our other operatives silent." My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to call Dante, as I tried to steady my breathing enough to think clearly, instead of just reacting with the kind of blind panic that got people killed in situations like this. And I realized with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins that this was exactly what our mysterious enemy had been planning all along, that every assassination attempt and every poisoned operative had been leading to this moment, to this trap that was designed specifically to separate me from Dante's protection and force me into a position where I had no leverage and no backup. I should have been thinking about strategy, about how to turn this situation to my advantage or at least how to survive it. But all I could think about was Nadia, my baby sister who had been 9 years old when our father died, who I'd raised and protected and kept innocent of the darkness that had consumed our family. And the idea of her being hurt or frightened or worse because of my choices made something primal and violent rise up inside me that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with love. Dante found me like that, standing in the middle of the guest room with the necklace clutched in my fist and tears streaming down my face that I hadn't even realized I was crying. And the look on his face when he saw me, when he understood what had happened without me having to say a single word, was something I'd never seen before. Something that looked like genuine anguish mixed with a fury so profound it seemed to make the air around him crackle with barely contained violence. "Give me the note," he said quietly, his voice deadly calm in a way that was somehow more terrifying than if he'd been shouting, and when I handed it to him, with trembling fingers, I watched his eyes scan the words once, twice, before he looked back up at me with an expression that made my breath catch, because it was the face of a man who'd just made a decision, who'd just committed to a course of action that would have consequences neither of us could fully predict. "We get her back," he said, and those 3 words, spoken with such absolute conviction and certainty, broke something inside me that had been holding itself together through sheer force of will. "We get her back together, Sarah, because I'm not letting you walk into an obvious trap alone, and I'm not letting anyone use your sister as leverage against either of us. And if that means mobilizing my entire organization for a girl I've never met, then that's exactly what's going to happen, because she matters to you, which means she matters to me, and I protect what's mine." The possessiveness in that last statement should have made me angry, should have made me bristle at being claimed like property. But instead it made something warm and desperate unfold in my chest, made me realize that somewhere in the last few weeks, I'd stopped being just a captive forced into service and had become something more, something that mattered to him beyond my utility as a bodyguard or my value as an asset. "Why?" I whispered, my voice breaking on the single syllable, needing to understand what drove this man, who was supposed to be a monster, who was supposed to care only about power and control, to risk everything for someone he'd never met simply because she was important to me. Dante crossed the distance between us and pulled me against his chest, his arms wrapping around me with a gentleness that seemed impossible from hands that had ordered so much death. And I could feel his heart beating steady and strong beneath my cheek as he spoke words that would change everything between us, words that would make it impossible to ever go back to the careful distance we'd been trying to maintain. Because 5 years ago, I lost my younger sister to the trafficking networks that operate in this city. Lost her to monsters who saw her as nothing more than merchandise to be sold to the highest bidder. And by the time I found her, by the time I'd built enough power and resources to track her down, it was too late. She was already gone in every way that mattered, broken beyond any hope of repair, and she took her own life 6 months later because living with what had been done to her was more painful than dying, he said, and I could hear the grief in his voice, raw and unhealed despite the years that had passed. I've spent every day since then building an empire strong enough to dismantle those networks piece by piece, to destroy the people who profit from that kind of suffering. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let history repeat itself with your sister. If I'm going to let someone use her as a pawn in whatever game they're playing with us. Because no one else gets to feel what I felt. No one else gets to live with that kind of failure. Not while I have the power to prevent it. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, recontextualizing everything I'd thought I understood about Dante Salvatore, about his motivations and his morality, and the careful line he seemed to walk between being exactly the monster his reputation suggested and being something infinitely more complicated. I didn't know, I breathed against his chest, understanding now why he'd been so willing to protect Nadia from the moment he'd learned she existed, why he'd built his criminal empire with such specific purpose and direction. I thought you were just another gangster playing at power, just another man who'd let the darkness consume him completely. But you're fighting, aren't you? You're fighting against the worst parts of this world even while you're trapped inside it. I'm not a good man, Sarah, and I never will be. Because the things I've done to get to this position, the people I've hurt and killed and destroyed to build the power necessary to fight these networks, those things can never be forgiven or forgotten, Dante said, and his hand came up to cup the back of my head, holding me against him like he was afraid I might disappear if he let go. But I'm trying to be better than the darkness that made me, trying to use the monster I've become to destroy worse monsters, and having you here, having someone who sees both sides of me and doesn't flinch from either one, it makes me believe that maybe there's still something worth salvaging in what I've become. I pulled back just enough to look up at him, to see the vulnerability in his storm cloud eyes that he usually kept hidden behind layers of cold calculation and controlled violence. And I understood with perfect clarity that this was the moment where everything would change, where we would either pull back from the edge we'd been teetering on, or we would fall together into something that would bind us more completely than any blackmail or coercion ever could. I'm terrified of you, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper, needing him to understand the full truth of what I was feeling. Not because you're dangerous, not because you've threatened my sister or forced me into your service, but because you make me want to stay, because you make me feel like this world I've been running from might be exactly where I belong, and that kind of acceptance, that kind of belonging, it's the most dangerous thing you could possibly offer me because once I accept it, once I let myself believe that I can have it, I'll never be able to walk away. His response was to kiss me, finally closing the distance we'd been maintaining for weeks, and it was desperate and consuming and tasted like desperation and promise in equal measure, and I kissed him back with everything I had, with all the fear and longing and complicated emotions that had been building between us since the moment I'd thrown wine on his shirt and looked into his eyes without flinching. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, I knew that whatever happened next, whatever danger we were about to walk into to save my sister, we would face it together. Not as blackmailer and victim, not as employer and employee, but as something far more dangerous and far more real, as two people who had found in each other a reflection of their own darkness and their own desperate desire for redemption. They say love is patient and kind, gentle like spring rain and soft like morning light. But our love was violent and bloody, forged in gunfire and sealed with a kiss over the corpse of the man who'd thought he could use my sister as leverage, who'd thought that threatening the only innocent thing left in my life would somehow give him power over me and over Dante. And as I stood in that abandoned warehouse with Nadia's arms wrapped around me and her tears soaking into my bullet-riddled jacket, I realized that some fairy tales need a little darkness to shine, that sometimes the monsters are the ones who save you, and that the most dangerous kind of love is the kind that makes you willing to burn the entire world down to protect what matters. The assault on Constantine Zima's stronghold had been brutal and efficient, a coordinated strike that involved every resource Dante possessed and left no room for mercy or hesitation, and I'd fought beside him with a synchronicity that felt like we'd been partners for years instead of weeks, like we'd been made to move through violence together, each of us covering the other's blind spots with an instinctive understanding that went beyond training or strategy into something that felt almost supernatural in its precision. We'd arrived at the warehouse just before midnight, the building a massive structure on the waterfront that had been abandoned for years and was now serving as Constantine's base of operations. And Dante's intelligence network had provided us with detailed schematics and guard rotations and every piece of information we'd needed to plan an approach that would get us to Nadia before anyone could use her as a hostage or worse. The plan had been complex, involving multiple entry points, and coordinated timing, and enough firepower to start a small war. But the moment we'd breached the perimeter and the first shots had been fired, all the planning had dissolved into pure instinct and adrenaline, and the kind of focused violence that came from knowing that failure wasn't an option, that my sister's life hung in the balance and nothing else mattered except getting to her before Constantine could carry out whatever threats he'd made in that note. I'd moved through the warehouse like a ghost. Like violence was a second language I'd been born speaking. And every target that fell to my bullets was one less obstacle between me and Nadia. One less person who could hurt her, or use her, or take her away from me the way this world had taken so much already. Dante had been magnificent in his fury, his usual cold control replaced by something hotter and more primal, something that spoke of personal stakes and deep-seated rage that went beyond just business or territory or pride. And I'd understood as I watched him fight that he was seeing his own sister in Nadia, was fighting not just to help me but to save the girl he hadn't been able to save 5 years ago, to rewrite history in some small way by making sure that this time, this one time, the innocent didn't pay the price for the sins of the guilty. We'd carved our way through Constantine's defenses like they were paper instead of trained soldiers, and every man who fell had been a choice they'd made when they'd decided to work for someone who trafficked in human misery, who saw people as commodities rather than souls. And I couldn't find it in myself to feel guilt or remorse for the lives we'd taken because they'd forfeited their right to mercy the moment they'd laid hands on my sister. I'd found Nadia in a storage room on the 3rd floor, bound to a chair with zip ties and tape over her mouth, but otherwise unharmed, and the relief that had flooded through me when I'd seen her alive and whole had been so intense it had nearly driven me to my knees, nearly made me forget that we were still in hostile territory, and that extraction was just as dangerous as entry had been. I'd cut her free and pulled her into my arms, and whispered reassurances that everything was going to be okay, even as gunfire continued to echo through the building, even as I knew that we weren't safe yet, that Constantine himself was still somewhere in this warehouse, and that he wouldn't let us walk out without a final confrontation that would determine whether we all made it home or whether this rescue mission would end in tragedy despite our best efforts. That confrontation had come in the main warehouse floor, a vast open space filled with shipping containers and industrial equipment and shadows deep enough to hide an army. And Constantine had emerged from those shadows with a gun already raised and aimed not at me or Dante but at Nadia, who I'd positioned behind me the moment we'd descended the stairs into this killing floor. He'd been smiling, this man who'd orchestrated everything, who'd used the Kozlov family's grudge against my father as a cover for his own agenda. And when he spoke, his voice had been conversational, almost friendly, as though we were discussing business terms rather than standing in a standoff that would end with someone dead. "Serafina Volkov," he'd said, and hearing my full name from his lips had sent ice down my spine. "I've wanted to meet you for 5 years, ever since your father stole something from me that was worth far more than the money the Kozlovs lost in that Prague deal. Something irreplaceable that I've spent half a decade trying to recover. And now, here you are, exactly where I need you to be. With exactly the leverage necessary to make you give me what I want." I hadn't understood what he meant, hadn't known what my father could possibly have taken that would be worth this elaborate revenge plot. This months-long campaign of assassination attempts, and poisoned operatives and carefully orchestrated chaos. But then Dante had moved slightly to my left, and I'd seen the recognition flash across his face, had seen him piece together something that I was still missing. "The ledger," Dante had said quietly, his gun trained on Constantine with rock-steady aim. Alexei had the complete trafficking ledger, the one that documented every transaction, every buyer, every victim, every person involved in the Eastern European networks, and he was planning to use it as insurance, as leverage to keep himself safe. But he died before he could make the exchange he'd been negotiating, which means the ledger disappeared with him. And his daughter inherited it without even knowing what she possessed, Constantine had confirmed, his smile widening into something predatory and hungry. Your father was smart enough to hide it somewhere his enemies wouldn't think to look. Somewhere he knew it would be safe even if he died. And I've spent 5 years tracking down every person he trusted, every place he might have stashed it, until I finally realized that the only person he would have trusted with something that valuable was his daughter, which means you have it, Serafina, even if you don't know you do, even if he hid it so cleverly that you've never found it in all these years of running and hiding. The realization had hit me like a physical blow, understanding flooding through me as I remembered the compass necklace my father had given me the night before he died. The one I'd passed down to Nadia because I couldn't bear to wear it anymore. Couldn't stand the constant reminder of everything I'd lost. And I'd known with absolute certainty that the ledger was hidden inside that compass, that my father had entrusted me with the key to destroying the trafficking networks that Dante had been fighting against for years, and that Constantine wanted it not to destroy those networks, but to use it as blackmail, to control and profit from the very evil that had destroyed so many lives, including Dante's sister. "You're not getting it," I'd said, my voice steady despite the gun pointed at my sister, despite knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether we all lived or died. "You're not getting the ledger, you're not getting my sister, and you're not walking out of this warehouse alive because I've spent too long running from my father's legacy to let someone like you profit from it." The shot had come from Constantine's gun, aimed at Nadia. But I'd already been moving, my body reacting before my mind had fully processed the threat. And I'd taken him down with 2 bullets to the chest and 1 to the head before his finger had fully depressed the trigger, before he could hurt the only innocent person in this entire bloody mess. He'd dropped like a puppet with cut strings, his weapon clattering to the concrete, and the silence that had followed his death had been absolute and profound, broken only by Nadia's sobbing and the distant sound of police sirens that meant Dante's people were already working to clean up the evidence and ensure that none of this would ever be traced back to us. Dante had moved to my side immediately, his hand finding mine and squeezing gently. And when I'd looked up at him, I'd seen something in his eyes that looked like pride and relief and something deeper, something that spoke of permanent bonds forged in blood and violence and shared purpose. The weeks that followed had been a whirlwind of activity and adjustment, of returning Nadia safely to her dorm with a security detail she didn't know existed and wouldn't need for much longer, of using the ledger my father had died protecting to systematically dismantle the trafficking networks that had plagued the city for decades, of watching Dante transform from the monster everyone feared into something closer to the man he'd always wanted to be. Someone who used his power and resources to protect rather than exploit, to build rather than destroy. We'd found the traitor in Dante's organization eventually, a lieutenant who'd been feeding information to Constantine in exchange for a percentage of the blackmail profits he'd expected to collect. And dealing with that betrayal had been brutal but necessary. A reminder that trust was the most valuable and most dangerous commodity in the world we inhabited. Standing now in Dante's war room 6 months after that night in the warehouse, with strategic maps spread across the table, and my sister safely finishing her freshman year under the protection of the most powerful crime boss in the city, I found myself reflecting on how completely my life had transformed from that moment I'd thrown wine on a stranger's shirt and inadvertently saved his life. Dante appeared behind me, his arms wrapping around my waist and his chin resting on my shoulder as he looked at the same maps I'd been studying. And when he spoke, his voice held the kind of contentment I'd never heard from him before. A peace that came from having found purpose beyond mere survival. "Marry me," he said simply, and it wasn't a question so much as a statement of inevitable fact, a recognition that we'd already bound ourselves together in ways that went deeper than any legal ceremony could sanctify. Be my partner in everything, not just the violence and the strategy, but in rebuilding this empire into something that might actually do more good than harm. Be my equal and my conscience and my queen, because I can't imagine facing another day of this life without you beside me. I turned in his arms to face him, seeing my own reflection in those storm cloud eyes that had captivated me from the first moment, and I thought about everything that had led to this point. All the violence and fear and desperate choices that had brought us together and forged us into something stronger than either of us could have been alone. I spilled wine on you to save your life, I said, reaching up to cup his face and feeling the rough stubble against my palm, feeling the warmth of skin and the steady pulse of life beneath my fingers. I'll spill blood to keep you, to build this better world you're dreaming of, to stand beside you as we transform your empire into something that might actually earn the loyalty your people give you. And I'll do it not because you're blackmailing me or threatening my sister, but because somewhere along the way I fell in love with the monster and the man, and I can't imagine my life without both. His kiss was answer enough, deep and claiming and full of promises for a future that looked nothing like the one I'd imagined for myself 5 years ago when I'd been running scared and trying to disappear. And when we finally broke apart, I knew with absolute certainty that I'd found my home not in a place but in a person, not in safety, but in the dangerous, complicated, beautiful partnership we'd built from blackmail and violence and desperate necessity. I'd come to this city to disappear, to become invisible and unremarkable and beneath notice, but instead, I'd found the one man who made me want to be seen, who made me want to embrace the darkness I'd inherited from my father and use it to create something better, something that might actually justify all the blood and pain and loss that had brought us to this moment. And if loving a monster makes me one too, if standing beside Dante Salvatore and helping him rebuild his empire into something that protects rather than exploits makes me complicit in his sins and his violence, then let the whole damn world fear us, because together we're going to tear down every system that profits from suffering. We're going to make this city safer for people like Nadia, who just want to live and love and dream without becoming victims. And we're going to do it with blood on our hands, and love in our hearts, and the absolute conviction that sometimes the monsters are the ones who save you. And sometimes salvation comes wrapped in darkness, and sealed with a kiss that tastes like danger and promise in equal measure.